Matt Schaff and Jared Small of DraftSharks.com here to look back at what we got wrong in 2024. Jared, it's easy and really a lot more fun to look back at the end of the season and highlight the player calls that we got right. Obviously, that's what we're trying to do, is get all of these things right, but we're always going to get some wrong. And it's nearly always more useful to actually look at what we got wrong, not so much to look at who or exactly what went wrong, but really more about the why, because that's what can help us going forward. Maybe we can avoid missing out on breakout players or over trusting the guys that busted, figuring out exactly why we got these things wrong so that we can change what made it go wrong the next time. We did collect data via our league sync at the end of the season. We found the percentage of synced teams in the Draft Sharks system, your teams that you synced to DraftSharks.com. We were particularly interested in the players who appeared on more or less of the rosters than you would normally expect. So we're talking about 10 to 12 team leagues most often. So the average is like 8 to 10%, depending on the size of your league. Obviously, most players that we talk about, care about, will appear on one roster in the league. You can also find an article on DraftSharks.com highlighting some of those key players. Do you agree, first of all, I guess, that looking at what we got wrong is generally more important than what we got right?
Sure. I mean, this show is going to be tough. It's going to be painful on Valentine's Day, no less. You're hurting my heart making us do this. But yeah, I mean, it's definitely more instructive to figure out where we can get better, right? Because if we kind of keep doing what we have been doing to get guys right, like we did with plenty of guys this year. But if we can improve our weaknesses, that's kind of, I think, the easiest way to be better fantasy players.
Right. And like I said, you can find the article on DraftSharks.com that goes over some of the players we collectively got wrong. For this show, Jared and I are going to pick out some personal misses, however, not necessarily guys from the article, although some of them might overlap. But these are guys that affected our drafts that we would have been better off if we had more of them on our teams. Jared, why don't you kick us off with a wide receiver?
Yeah, and I know a lot of Draft Sharks folks had Jaylen Waddle. He was near the top of that list of most owned players. Jaylen Waddle was one of my most owned wide receivers, and that's saying something considering this guy was, a round 3 pick in most fantasy drafts. My most costly miss, to me, easily the most surprising outcome of the 2024 season was how poorly Jaylen Waddle produced. I mean, we're talking about a wide receiver that's 26 years old, scored 14 plus PPR points in each of his first 3 NFL seasons, drops down below 10 last year, finishes 49th in total PPR points among wide receivers, 59th in points per game. There were 2 problems for Waddle last year. He lost volume and his efficiency declined. Both those things happened. It's going to be a rough season for you. 5.8 targets per game for Waddle last year on a 16.5% target share. That was down from 7.7 and 6.9 targets per game the previous 2 seasons. 20+% target share in both of those previous 2 seasons. So big drop in both total volume and target share. And then on the efficiency side, career lows last year in yards per route, yards after catch per reception, PFF receiving grade, ESPN receiver score, basically any metric you want to look at. Like, it was Waddle's worst season of his 4-year career. Should we have seen this coming with Jaylen Waddle? Should he have been a guy we were avoiding? I think the volume side, you could argue that we thought Devon Achane's role was going to increase. There was some Jonnu Smith buzz from Mike McDaniel this summer. So, maybe you could have said there is some increased target competition here. I still wouldn't have ever predicted the extent to which Waddle's volume dropped. And then really on the efficiency side, I think there was no reason to predict this efficiency decline from a player of Waddle's caliber and age, right? Like, he's not at the age cliff. He's kind of actually right in smack dab of his prime. The efficiency drop was a result of a bad Dolphins offensive line. They just couldn't get anything going downfield. We saw that with Tyreek Hill as well. His downfield usage and production tanked from previous seasons. And then the Tua Tagovailoa injuries. Even if you look at Waddle's production with and without Tua, 1.78 yards per route in 10 games with Tua, 1.02 in 5 games without. So that really hurt. So I guess ultimately, he's not a miss I'm too upset with myself about. I think generally if we're betting on former first round wide receivers at this stage of their careers, it's usually not going to hurt like it did with Waddle this past year. I do think if we're looking ahead to 2025, should we expect a bounce back? Well, I would say Achane and Jonnu Smith are back. I don't think Mike McDaniel wants his offense to operate as it did this past season, with so much of the targets going on that short range stuff to Achane and Jonnu Smith. So we'll see what the Dolphins do along the offensive line. I think that's going to be a big key. And of course, obviously keeping Tua healthy, but I think Waddle is someone, despite missing on him last year, someone I'm going to be willing to bet on a bounce back in 2025.
Yeah, I think that the player himself and the player type are not necessarily bad bets. I think what we need to do, kind of overarching principle here, is to be realistic about how much sense a guy makes at his draft cost. Like, it's one thing to be in on a player, it's another thing to be in on him no matter where he's going. And of course, the earlier obviously a guy goes, the riskier he is going to be. So you really have to be honest with yourself about how much upside he has from that draft position. I think that was kind of the at least mild miscalculation on Waddle. He was going early enough, especially in more wide receiver friendly formats like best ball drafting, that it was important to look at the fragility that's there. He's, even though he's an efficient player and a good player, he was behind Tyreek Hill pretty clearly in target share from the year before. We know the team likes to run the ball. We also know that Miami was hyper efficient on offense the year before. And although I think we should continue expecting them to be above average on the efficiency front, I think in general, when we see a team that's hyper efficient in any area, yardage, scoring, whatever, we should expect them to come down from that the following season just on luck, because it's very difficult to do stuff like that year after year. That can apply to how much a team scores overall. It could apply to any aspect. Be wary of that hyper efficiency just coming down naturally, because it's more likely to do so. Like you mentioned, Tua Tagovailoa's injury, we knew heading into the season that he was a bit more fragile. So I think just like all those factored in, I think it would have been okay to be in on Waddle, maybe not focus in on him quite so much, especially when you look at some of the other guys going around him. Malik Neighbors was behind him in ADP for one thing. T. Higgins was behind him. DJ Moore was in that area, Devontae Smith. So I think it would have been a good area to mix it around a little bit more. That's one of the tough things to do, is you fall in love with players and you want to just gobble them up. And especially if you are drafting a bunch of teams like in a best ball portfolio, it's tough to spread it around there, but that's, I think, one of the most important things to do, especially for that format.
For sure. And I think the number 2 wide receiver point you made with Waddle is a good one, because I think he was right there with Devonta Smith as the most expensive number 2 wide receiver in the NFL. And that maybe should have given us some pause at his cost.
Yeah, and if you're chasing a guy, especially earlier in the draft, you got to think he needs to still have upside, even if he's, inside wide receiver 2 territory. Ask yourself, does he have upside to finish in the top 10? And if you think the upside's like wide receiver 16 from wide receiver 20 in ADP, then that's not somebody that you should be overly excited about. I will also add, I was talking about best ball, but in lineup setting, I think it's a bit more okay to reach for a player like this. But you can also do so and guard against it. Like, you could say, I want to be in on Waddle. I know there's some risk, so I'm also going to use, this next pick on a wide receiver. I'm going to take 2 more by this certain level. I think when you're playing in a lineup setting league, it's okay to do that and know that there's some risk to that player, just in case he does, have everything break right for him. I'm going to go wide receiver as well. And for me, it's a combo. It's Gabe Davis versus Brian Thomas Jr. on the Jacksonville Jaguars. I don't think that Gabe Davis himself as a standalone was a bad pick. He went around wide receiver 60 in ADP, obviously didn't do anything to help us, but I'm not going to change anything going forward other than maybe to believe less in Gabe Davis next year. But I think in general, if you see a veteran free agent wide receiver sign a big contract with a new team, it was $13 million per year for Gabe Davis in this case, I think that guy is a solid bet in wide receiver 60 range, especially if he's showed us that he has at least spike week potential. I think all you have to do is look at Darnell Mooney from last season. Very similar prospect, came from a different team, signed basically the exact same contract, was not the best wide receiver on his new team, but there were targets available. Darnell Mooney definitely worked out. Gabe Davis definitely did not. But in this case, the bad move for me was favoring Gabe Davis so heavily over Brian Thomas Jr. And I mean, first of all, there's the rookie wide receiver angle. And Jared, I looked back just to make sure I was correct, but in the best ball strategy article that's on draftsharks.com that I wrote, literally it says target rookie wide receivers. So here's a rookie wide receiver drafted in the first round, going in the 40s in ADP, often in the low 40s. There was really no downside to getting some Brian Thomas Jr. And I didn't need to say, I hate Gabe Davis to take Brian Thomas Jr. My mistake was saying, well, why would I take Brian Thomas Jr. when I can wait another few rounds and take Gabe Davis? It's a stupid way to look at it, because it made me be relatively out on Thomas, even though there were clear signals that pointed to the upside. I'm not saying we should have known he had wide receiver 1 in fantasy 2024 upside, but the fact that he was a first round pick by a team that already had Christian Kirk, already threw the money at Gabe Davis. He was an early entrant into the NFL. All of that says this is a talented guy. Go ahead and make at least some level of bet on him. The $13 million contract a year for Gabe Davis, I used to justify favoring him, but the first round draft capital should at least play a similar role in terms of, framing what the team thinks of him and the opportunity presented to him. I think I just ignored those factors, fell into one lane of thinking, and stayed there to my own detriment.
Yeah, targeting rookie wide receivers is a tenet of our best ball strategy. Chasing upside, especially in the later rounds, is a pillar of our just general fantasy football draft strategy. And that's I think the mistake here with Davis versus Thomas Jr. Reasonable baseline projections had these guys close heading into the season, right? Like Gabe Davis has been a 16-17% target share guy. That's what he was in Buffalo. That's kind of what we had him projected for in Jacksonville. 16-17%. That's kind of a fair baseline projection for a first round rookie wide receiver. But the reason we have ceiling projections is a case like this. I think the odds of Gabe Davis last year or at any point of his career becoming a 22+% target guy is just very slim at this point. When we've seen this guy in the league for 4 or 5 years, Brian Thomas Jr., that upside was there. Was it the likeliest thing? Probably not. I'm looking back at it now, yes, but at this time last year, you wouldn't have said that was most likely, but it was a better chance than Gabe Davis. So if we are looking for upside, if we're looking for that ceiling, that's to me what should have pushed Thomas ahead of Gabe Davis.
Exactly. And in this particular case, I didn't know much about Brian Thomas Jr., relative to what everybody else knew. And none of us really did because he was a rookie heading into the league. But we did know that Christian Kirk is a limited guy who is not even always on the field in 2 wide receiver sets for Jacksonville. We knew that Gabe Davis was a limited guy in Buffalo who was really just a spike week player. So I should have then said, well, maybe the range of outcomes does include Brian Thomas Jr. turning into the number 1 wide receiver for this team at some point. So that's what I'm going to keep in mind going forward. And you can also find another rookie wide receiver that I made similar miscalculations on in the article on Draft Sharks. So make sure you check that out. Jared, I know you've got a rookie from a different position now.
Yeah, Jonathon Brooks was a major miss for me. He was like my favorite mid-round range target, round 9, round 10, I think round 8 he ended up going by the end. To me, players returning from injury is like the biggest challenge left in fantasy football. We've all gotten a lot better at this game. We obviously haven't perfected it, but figuring out what to do with these guys coming back from major injuries is super tough. And there probably is no answer, right? Because we don't have these guys' medicals. We're not in the training room. We're not talking to these team doctors. What we do know is that, guys coming off significant injuries are almost always discounted in fantasy drafts. I mean, again, Jonathon Brooks was an 8th or 9th round pick last year. If he did not have an ACL tear and had his final college season, got drafted early round 2 to Carolina, he would have been 4th or 5th round pick, at least in fantasy drafts. So we were getting that discount. That made him enticing. And we have seen plenty of guys coming off injuries that were discounted pay off. I mean, just look at Breece Hall back in 2023, coming off the 2022 ACL tear, finishes RB16 on the season, but RB2 from week 5 on. I mean, Breece Hall was an excellent pick, obviously, in 2023 fantasy draft. So, situations like this can hit a lot of times. And that's kind of what I had on my mind when I was, drafting so much Jonathon Brooks, who, by the way, was on a pretty similar timeline as Breece Hall. Jonathon Brooks' ACL tear came about 2 weeks later in his season than Breece Hall's did. I still think there was some type of setback with Brooks that we never heard about. I mean, it took him over a year past his ACL injury to even debut for Carolina, and obviously re-tears his ACL 3 weeks later. But that's kind of my point, is that Panthers didn't have to tell us that there was some type of setback or that something went wrong with the rehab. We probably should have read it that way. Even in the summer where we kind of thought, Brooks would at least be on the field doing more in camp. And he wasn't. So we probably should have read into that a bit more. But to me, again, we're never going to know the full truth with these guys coming off serious injury. So to me, the lessons learned here, 1, make sure to properly factor in downside. Along with that, if you're a high volume drafter, make sure you're hedging on these guys. Don't be too exposed. And I know we're going to talk about Chuba Hubbard, but he was such an easy hedge, right? If I was taking so much Jonathon Brooks, take 25% of those Brooks shares and just turn them into Chuba Hubbard, because there were plenty of reasons to like this Carolina situation in general.
Yeah, I think Jonathon Brooks as a player type was an okay gamble around RB35 in ADP. Like you said, just don't go overboard with it if you're drafting a whole portfolio of teams. My bigger miss is the guy that you just mentioned, his teammate, Chuba Hubbard, because I was skeptical of Jonathon Brooks coming off the ACL tear. I didn't draft a whole lot of them, and yet for some reason, I didn't turn that skepticism into, oh, how about I go ahead and bet on the number 2 running back in this Carolina backfield? And my biggest problem, the reason that I got there is because, Jared, I still do too much of this guy's not good. I know that running back doesn't matter means that even not good running backs can produce. I've watched every season of the Najee Harris series, so I know that not good running backs can produce fantasy numbers. And instead of focusing on the clear opportunity available to Hubbard in Carolina behind this rookie running back that gave me skepticism, I focused still on, Hubbard's not that good. What's he going to do for me from this range? I'd rather draft some other schlub. Like, we're talking about running back 40s. So it's not like I was favoring some stud that, rocketed my rosters to the top. I'm vowing to myself, and I'll probably still break it, but I'm vowing to myself to focus less on this guy's not good and more on, hey, look at the opportunity upside here. Go ahead and take some shots just in case things do go his way. And then he can still be not that good and put up big numbers. And then, maybe everything breaks right and he actually turns from not that good to better than I thought and has Chuba Hubbard's 2024.
And there are some reasons to be optimistic about Hubbard heading into last year. I mean, he was 14th in PFF rushing grade in 2023. And you know who we knew is definitely not good heading into last year? Miles Sanders. So we should have known that Hubbard was at least, locked in to be the number 2 back there. And again, part of the reason we liked Jonathon Brooks, or I liked Jonathon Brooks so much, was because of Dave Canales, because of what he did for Rashad White in Tampa Bay in 2023. That part was right. Canales helped Hubbard turn in that massive fantasy season.
I will say the flip side of he's not that good is this year I'm not excited about Chuba Hubbard at his elevated price. He's like round 4 in best ball ADP right now. I think he's going in an appropriate range. Not somebody I'm targeting because he's not that good, but that's okay in that range. It's not okay when the guy's RB45.
Yep, exactly.
Who you got next?
Javonte Williams, my third miss here, and really was going right in that range with Jonathon Brooks, 8th, 9th, 10th round of fantasy drafts. And to me, Javonte Williams was a bet on 2 things. One was Denver's offense being better than expected, and 2, Williams returning to pre-injury form. One of those things ended up being right. Denver's offense was better than expected under Sean Payton. The Broncos finished 19th in total yards, 10th in total points last year. And even the running backs as a whole, they were 18th in total running back PPR points. So it was a decent situation for fantasy production. But of course, Javonte Williams did not return to pre-injury form at all. 3.7 yards per carry, dead last in PFF rushing grade, 45th among 47 qualifiers in rush yards over expected per attempt. So again, same kind of lesson with Jonathon Brooks. I think I have to stop being so damn optimistic about these players. Like if a player like Javonte shows us a poor season, you can say maybe it was the knee injury, maybe he's going to bounce back, but don't go all in on that happening, because there's obviously just as good a chance, if not better a chance, that just, what we saw the previous year is going to happen again for that player.
I think part of that is probably a fairly unique issue, maybe not totally unique, but it's a more difficult thing for us because our job is to tout some players. We try not to overdo it, but basically to find some favorite values and then convince other people that they're going to help their team. So that's just naturally going to make you root for a player, want to get more of a player. So I think the more you're drafting, the more it's important to spread it around a little bit and build in the, maybe I'm wrong about this guy, or maybe something doesn't go quite his way that I'm hoping will. I think specific to Javonte Williams, we need to make sure that we're being honest with ourselves about what the guy has been to this point and not what we all hoped he would be. Because I think there was a lot more what I hope Javonte Williams is going to become early in his career than actual signals that he was heading towards something truly difference making in fantasy. And I think once we got a healthy Javonte Williams, we had people going back to, oh, this is what he was going to turn into. Now he can be it, as opposed to this is what he was, and now he can be it again. So that's going to be, a lot more specific to each individual player. I would say just to broaden it again. I think like Jonathon Brooks, Javonte Williams was an okay guy to take some shots on. Don't overdo it and make sure you don't chase him up the ADP board.
Yeah, and be careful about injuries too, right? Because Javonte Williams was not just a knee injury, it was a multi-ligament knee injury. It was worse than an ACL. So that probably should have, at least in our minds, had him as a riskier pick than someone just coming off a clean ACL.
And I think that's something we're going to need to carry to our in-season decisions and rankings and everything as well, is judging these injuries and not to assume that just because a guy's back to full practice, he's all the way back to full strength and he's exactly what he was pre-injury. It'll certainly be something on my mind as we go forward. Also on my mind as I draft 2025 teams is basically missing out on Alvin Kamara in 2024. I came around a little bit late in draft season last year and added some kind of on the just in case I'm wrong basis. And of course I was wrong because Kamara was going well into RB2 territory, the exact spot last year, depending on where you were drafting and when you were drafting, but he finished RB5 in PPR points per game. So clearly he was a wrong call versus ADP. And it's kind of the opposite of Javonte Williams here. The message is not that we should ignore our wariness of an age 29 running back next time, because that was, a big thing with Kamara. The previous few seasons, he'd been fairly inefficient running the ball, and now he's hitting an age 29 season. And our aging curve data, our research into the way players age, have showed us that historically running backs often fall off in that age 29 season. So I don't think we should now point to Alvin Kamara's 2024 and say, well, that was wrong. I'm not going to worry about 29-year-olds going forward. I think what we need to do is consider the risk reward proposition of where a player is getting drafted and consider how that player scores points. If Alvin Kamara were a more typical running back whose scoring was more balanced, or especially if it was more leaning on his rushing stuff, then there would have been more reason to be wary of him heading into drafts last year. But his greatest area of value is the receiving. He played 14 games last year and he still led all running backs in targets. He was on an offense that was clearly short on target options and with a quarterback, Derek Carr, who we already knew liked to check down. So I should have told myself, even if Alvin Kamara declines here, he's probably going to get plenty of targets as long as he stays healthy. And the other thing that made me lean away from Kamara was liking Kendre Miller, especially at cost, and, betting on him getting more of the touch share in the backfield. It would have been okay, though, to be in on both Kendre Miller going very late and Alvin Kamara not going super early. Like he was going, round 4, round 5, maybe even round 6 at times, late enough that I could have mixed in both of those players. And I think that's similar to the Gabe Davis, Brian Thomas Jr. question. Sometimes it's, no, I choose this guy because I think this guy's going to let us down, but it doesn't need to always be that way with teammates. And a lot of times it shouldn't be.
Kamara was a major miss for me too, despite our rankings saying he was a good pick. But the three things with Kamara for me, as you said, one, consider the player archetype. I think pass catching backs like Kamara are more likely to produce into their late 20s, 30s than, between the tackles grinders. Two, consider the player not just in a vacuum, but at his price. The decline risk on Kamara. Kamara in 2023 was RB5 in PPR points per game, RB3 in expected PPR points per game. His decline risk was fully factored into the price. Unless you thought he was just going to flat out lose the job to Kendre Miller, like the decline risk was factored in. And then the third thing with Kamara, just trust the projections. It's literally why we do projections. We projected Kamara's volume to dip from 2023 and his efficiency to remain weak this past season, and he still came out as a big value in our projection. So kicking myself, it's literally why we preach projections being super important. It's for a reason like Alvin Kamara. I, for whatever reason, decided to almost completely ignore it last year, and it definitely cost me.
Yeah. So we'll keep all that in mind as we build and refine our projections for 2025. The initials are already up there. You can check out the 2025 rankings on draftsharks.com right now. You can see the guys that you think we might get wrong in 2025. We will be updating those during our annual Draft Sharks winter meetings, which are coming up. And if you're drafting best ball teams right now, Jared and I are right there with you in the draft rooms. So you can look for that to affect our rankings and outlooks to some degree. You can look for more content around that stuff. We've got profiles on the incoming rookies already hitting draftsharks.com right now. More of that's going to hit the site as we get into the scouting combine and all the other pre-draft stuff. And of course, lots of other more new stuff coming to the site, whether that's content, tools, everything you need, because the goal of all of this including our looking back on what we got wrong and why, is to make Draft Sharks your unfair advantage.